When I was clearing out my husband's workshop this past spring, I found a coffee tin wedged behind the bandsaw, and taped to the lid was an envelope with my name on it. Underneath my name he'd written, in those careful capital letters he used for anything that mattered, "For my wife. Do not tell those doctor." Inside was a small brass key and a slip of paper with the name of a credit union 2 towns over and a man I'd never heard of. I drove there the very next morning. What I found in that box is the reason I'm telling you any of this at all. Hello again, friends, it's me. Please give this one a thumbs up if you would, and stay with me right to the end. Because this story turns in ways I never could have guessed standing in that cold workshop in my parka. And do tell me in the comments which part of this country you're listening from tonight. I like knowing how far a story can travel from a little town nobody's heard of. I was married to my husband, Gordon, for 47 years, and I would have sworn on anything you put in front of me that I knew the whole of that man. We met in the winter of 1977 at the curling club in Dunmore, Ontario at a Saturday bonspiel, where he was sweeping for the mill team and I was pouring coffee in the warm room because my friend had talked me into helping. He came in red-faced from the ice and asked me, very seriously, whether the double-doubles were free, or whether he owed me a quarter. I told him they were free, but the conversation cost $1. He paid in dimes. We were married 18 months later in the United Church on Bridge Street, and we never lived more than a half hour from that church for the rest of his life. Gordon was a millwright. He started on the floor at the paper mill the year we married and worked his way up to maintenance supervisor over 32 years. And he was the kind of man who could fix anything with a wrench and patience. He fixed the furnace, the dock, the old Buick, and more than once he fixed me when the long nights of nursing had wrung me out and I came home with nothing left. I spent 31 years on the floor at the hospital in town. We were never wealthy. We were what my mother would have called comfortable, which around here means the mortgage gets paid, and there's enough left over for a week at the cottage in August. We raised our daughter in a little brick house on Sumac Street. We argued about whether to keep the heat at 18 or 19. We had a canoe and a wood stove and a string of Christmas lights that Gordon refused to throw out no matter how many bulbs went dark. It was a good life. An ordinary, good life, and I want you to hold on to that word ordinary, because it matters to everything that comes after. Gordon died in February. It was his heart which had been failing him slow for the better part of a year, so it wasn't a shock the way the phone ringing at 3 in the morning is a shock. It was more like watching the lake freeze. You know it's coming, you watch it happen, and still one morning you wake up, and the water you swam in your whole life has turned to something you can stand on, hard and strange and silent. I was holding his hand at the end. Our daughter was out in the hospital corridor on the phone with her husband. I have never forgotten that she was on the phone with him in the very minute her father left us. The grief was not the loud kind. People expect the loud kind. Mine was a fob that filled the house and didn't lift, and I moved through the weeks after the funeral, on habit alone, washing casserole dishes to return them, writing thank you cards at the kitchen table, sleeping on my own side of a bed that had gotten far too big. It was late April before I could make myself go out to the workshop. Gordon's workshop was a tidy place, more orderly than our kitchen ever was. Pegboard with the outline of every tool drawn around it in black marker so he'd know what was missing. Baby food jars of screws sorted by size, screwed to the underside of a shelf by their lids. I was going through the cabinet at the back, the one that smelled of motor oil and sawdust, when I found that coffee tin and that envelope with my name and his instruction not to tell our daughter. I stood there a long while in the dusty light from the one window. I noticed my hands weren't shaking, which surprised me. I want to tell you something about the months before that, because it explains why I didn't simply tear it open and laugh and call my daughter to read it to her. In the weeks after the funeral, my daughter and her husband had started circling, and I'd known it even while I'd pretended I didn't. It came in small ways at first. My son-in-law mentioned twice that they were stretched thin, that the renovation had cost more than they'd planned, and that Gordon had always said he'd be there for them when the time came. My daughter asked, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, whether I'd thought about whether the house was too much for one person now. They offered, very kindly, to come help me sort through Gordon's papers. When I said I could manage, there was a pause on the line that lasted half a beat too long. I'd put it down to grief making everyone peculiar. I'd given them the benefit of the doubt, the way a mother does right up until the doubt gets too heavy to carry. But now I was standing in a cold workshop, holding a warning that my husband of 47 years had hidden from his only child. I didn't open it out there. Something stopped me. I carried it inside, locked the back door, sat down at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 10,000 suppers, and I opened it slowly, like it might be hot. The note inside was short because Gordon was always short on paper and long in person. He'd written my name at the top the way he did when he was being serious. My full name, not the nickname he used the rest of the time. He wrote that there were things he should have told me sooner, and that he'd been wrong to wait. He wrote that everything in the box was mine and mine alone. He asked me, please, to speak to the man at the credit union, a Mr. Fenwick, before I spoke to anyone else, and he underlined anyone, and then below it he'd written, especially not our daughter. And at the bottom he wrote that he loved me, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to be brave enough. Brave enough. That was the phrase that frightened me more than the key did. This was a man who'd sat with me through 2 miscarriages and a cancer scare that turned out to be nothing, who'd watched his own father disappear into dementia and never once flinched from the visits. Gordon had never needed courage for anything in his life that I'd seen. And here he was telling me from beyond that telling me something had required more nerve than he'd had for years. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed and went through everything I thought I knew about our money, which I'd always handled the day-to-day of. The joint checking, the small savings, the RRSPs we'd rolled into a RIF, the life insurance I'd already filed for. All of it accounted for, all of it ordinary, all of it adding up to exactly the modest sum I'd expected of a millwright and a nurse from Dunmore. And yet there was a brass key on my nightstand catching the light from the hall. I was at the kitchen table again at 4 a.m. with coffee I couldn't taste. I thought about my daughter. She turned 44 that spring. As a girl, she'd been tender, the kind of child who cried at the end of every movie and never forgot a birthday. But somewhere in her 30s, after she married, something in her had shifted. And I'd watched it happen the way you watch a shoreline erode, too slow to point at on any given day and undeniable over years. Her husband was not a cruel man, exactly. He was a strategic one. He sold mortgages and then investments, and he had a way of turning every conversation toward what a thing was worth. He'd come from a family that had money once and lost it, and I'd always had the uncharitable thought that he'd married my daughter as a kind of long position, a bet that would pay out eventually. Over the years, he'd reshaped her, her priorities, the words she used, the way she looked at our little house. She didn't call just to talk anymore. She called when she needed something. I hated thinking it. But there was the tally I'd refused to keep, laid out plain at 4 a.m. In the 2 months since the funeral, my daughter had asked me 4 separate times about, as her husband called it, the estate. He used that word about a brick house on Sumac Street and a cottage on Cedar Lake as though I'd inherited a manor. He mentioned he'd spoken with an advisor, a colleague of his, who felt that consolidating a widow's assets was simply prudent at my age. He offered to bring that colleague by, each offer dressed up as concern, each one a hand reaching out for something that wasn't theirs yet, and the cold thought I couldn't push down was this: he doesn't know about the box, but he can smell that there's something to find, because if he'd known, that box would already be empty. By the time the sun came up, I'd made 3 decisions. The first was that I would go to the credit union alone, ask for Mr. Fenwick by name as Gordon had told me to, and tell no one until I understood what I was dealing with. The second was that I'd call my own lawyer, not the colleague my son-in-law kept dangling, but a woman named Joan Albright who'd drawn up our wills 20 years before, a sharp, unhurried woman I'd known since our girls were in brownies together. The third decision was the hard one. Until I understood what was in that box and why Gordon had hidden it, I would tell my daughter nothing. I'd be warm. I'd be the grieving mother she expected to find. But I would not be open with her, not yet. Was that a kind of lying? Maybe. But my husband had kept a secret for reasons I didn't yet understand and had asked me in his last words to me to keep it too. He'd known our daughter's nature better than anyone alive, and he'd loved her, and he'd still written "Do not tell." That told me everything I needed to know about how much danger I might be in. I dressed in my good slacks, put the key in the zippered pocket of my purse, and waited for the credit union to open. It was in Peterborough, an hour east, a quiet branch with gray carpet and a fern by the window that looked older than I was. I asked for Mr. Fenwick and watched the young teller's face do a small, careful thing. The look of someone who's been told to expect a particular visitor. Mr. Fenwick was near 60, neat with reading glasses on a chain and the soft courtesy of a man who handles other people's private business for a living. He shook my hand and took me back to a little office and closed the door. He told me he was glad I'd come, that my husband had said I would, eventually, that I might take a few months and need the time. I asked him how long Gordon had been coming. He told me 12 years, once or twice a year. They'd have a coffee. My husband, he said, was a private man, but he spoke of me every single time. 12 years. For 12 years, Gordon had been driving an hour east and saying nothing. The deposit box was bigger than I'd pictured. Mr. Fenwick set me up alone in a small room with it, the way they do, and left. I lifted the lid and then I had to sit down. There were 3 things in it. The first was a ledger, a real ledger with a cloth cover, filled cover to cover in Gordon's block printing, every line dated, documenting investments going back to 2003. Mutual funds. GICs that rolled over year after year. A duplex in Peterborough I had never heard of, generating rent. Modest positions in companies whose names I half recognized from the business section he used to read at breakfast. Every entry dated, every column totaled, and at the bottom of the last page, updated in January, the month before he died, a single figure in his plain hand, $581,000. I read it 3 times. My hands were shaking now. The second thing was a folder with the deed to the duplex and statements for an account I'd never seen, in both our names, with the mail directed to a post office box I didn't know we had. The third was a sealed letter, longer than the note in the workshop. I won't read you every word because some of it belongs only to me, but the meaning of it was this. Gordon had built this slowly, quietly, over more than a decade for one reason. He had watched our daughter change after she married. He had watched her husband treat money as something to be moved, extracted, redirected, and he had watched our girl become his instrument in it. And he had come to fear, slowly and with great sorrow, that if the full size of our savings were ever known, it would not be safe. Not safe from 2 people who had already begun to treat what we had as a right rather than a gift. He hadn't hidden it from me, he wrote. He'd hidden it through me. He'd kept it invisible so that it could be handed to me whole, after he was gone, when the moment was right, and only to me. He'd been protecting me, not from strangers, from family who'd decided what I owed them. I sat in that little gray room a long time. Then I took a photograph of every page with my phone, put everything back exactly as I'd found it, locked the box, and asked Mr. Fenwick to make a note that I alone had access and to flag any attempt by anyone else to so much as ask about it. He nodded as if he'd been waiting for me to say it. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. By the time I turned up our road, I understood the shape of the thing. It wasn't only grief anymore. And it wasn't only money. It was a question about what sort of woman I meant to be from here on. The one who lets herself be managed. Or the one my husband believed in when he wrote that he was sorry it had taken him so long to be brave. That very afternoon my daughter called. Light, casual, the studied ease of someone trying hard not to seem in a hurry. Her husband's colleague was free anytime, she said. I shouldn't have to deal with all the paperwork alone, she said. I told her I appreciated it. I kept my voice soft. I was already dialing Joan Albright before I'd hung up the phone. Joan's office was above the pharmacy on the main street, everything in it slightly mismatched and everything in it working. She was 62, with reading glasses on a beaded chain of her own, and the patience of a woman who'd spent her whole career being underestimated by men in better suits. I laid it all out on her desk, the photos of the ledger and the deed and the statements, and Gordon's 2 letters. She read in silence. She asked me 3 questions, then she sat back. Your husband, she said, was a clever man. The accounts are legally yours. The deed transfers clean under the will. The RIF rolls to you tax-free, as the spouse. There's no gray area here at all. He set this up like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Then she tapped the photo of the ledger and looked at me over the glasses. What you're describing with your daughter and her husband isn't a legal threat yet, but it can become one if you're not standing ahead of it. We spent 2 hours together. By the end, I had a plan. Joan would file for probate on everything, including the assets nobody knew about, with full documentation, all of it transferred cleanly into my name alone. The duplex would be properly appraised. The investments would be consolidated with an advisor Joan trusted, a calm, plain-spoken woman named Kathleen Burke. And, most important, we'd build a clear record that I had sought my own independent counsel, that I'd been fully advised and had decided freely, and that no other party had touched any of it. That record, Joan told me, was the shield. Over the next 2 weeks, I did each step quietly. I met Kathleen Burke and went through every account. I signed what needed signing in Joan's office. I had the duplex looked at. And the whole time I went on taking my daughter's calls, listening to her husband's gentle suggestions through her, and saying nothing. It was my son-in-law who worked it out first. I should have known it would be. In a town this size, everyone knows someone, and he knew someone at the credit union the way he knew someone everywhere. He called on a Wednesday, and the practiced warmth was gone out of his voice. He said he understood I'd been in to see the manager in Peterborough. He didn't say how he knew. He said he and my daughter felt they had a right to be part of any major decisions about family money. He said the words family money 3 times. I told him, evenly, that Gordon had left me as sole executor and beneficiary, that I was handling things with my own lawyer, and that he was welcome to have an attorney review the probate filing when it became public record. I was polite. I did not move an inch. 20 minutes later, my daughter called, and she wasn't as smooth as her husband. Her voice had that tightness it used to get as a teenager when she felt cornered, and I'd know it anywhere. She said I was being secretive. She said her father would have wanted her involved. She said she was the only child, the only heir. I'm not gone yet, sweetheart, I said as gently as I could, and neither is your father's will, which names me. You're welcome to read it. There was a long silence, and then she said something in a flat voice that didn't sound like my girl at all. We know about the box, Mum. We know there's more than what's in the will, and if you won't be reasonable, we'll have to look at whether Dad was even in his right mind when he set all this up. There it was. They meant to challenge the will and claim my husband hadn't been of sound mind. My hands went cold. My voice did not. That's your right, I said. My lawyer is Joan Albright. From here on, anything you have to say should go through her. And I hung up, and then I sat at the kitchen table and cried, not from weakness, but from the particular grief of watching your child turn into someone you have to protect yourself from. But under the fear was something harder, and it had Gordon's handwriting on it. He'd been afraid too. He'd done the right thing anyway. I could do no less. Joan was unruffled when I called her. A capacity challenge with no medical evidence behind it, she said, is almost impossible to win, and she'd respond to it formally. She told me to write down every contact from my daughter and her husband from now on. Then she told me to go and be a person for a few days. So I drove down to my sister Bev's place in Belleville, and I walked her old beagle, and ate her cooking, and slept 8 hours a night, and let myself be somebody's little sister for a while, instead of a widow under siege. When I came home, I was ready. The first move came the day after I got back. A great extravagant arrangement of lilies and white roses arrived at the door with a card. "Mom, we love you." We were out of line. "Can we start over?" I set the flowers on the counter and looked at them a good long while. They were beautiful, and that, I understood, was exactly the point. My daughter called that evening with her warmth all reassembled. They'd been under such strain. Losing her father had hit harder than she'd let on. Would I come for Sunday supper? Just to clear the air. Her husband wanted to talk. Surely there was enough for everyone, she said. Surely there was no reason for any of this to be adversarial. Enough for everyone. There it was, plain as a price tag. The flowers were a down payment on a different kind of conversation, the kind where I'd sit at her table and be lovingly, patiently talked into giving away what my husband had deliberately and legally left to me. I thanked her for the flowers and said I needed more time. When I hung up, what I felt wasn't anger. It was a clean kind of clarity, the settled sort that comes when you stop hoping a thing will fix itself and accept that you're the one who have to. I put the flowers out with the recycling. Not out of spite. I simply didn't want them in my house. And then I did something I should have done weeks before. I picked up the phone and I called people. I called my neighbor Pearl, who'd been bringing soup over and whom I'd been politely turning away. I called my friend Lois, widowed 6 years back, who understood certain things without my having to say them. I called our minister, Reverend Mackenzie, not for the Bible exactly, but for the company of a man whose intentions I trusted. And I called my granddaughter, Maddie, who was 22 and at university out in Vancouver, and who 2 weeks earlier had texted me, quietly, "Grandma, I don't know what's going on, but if you ever need anything, call me." I hadn't, because I hadn't wanted to put her in the middle of her own parents. But that text had stayed with me, because it told me that whatever was going on in that house, it wasn't unanimous. Maddie picked up on the second ring, and we talked for an hour. She was careful. She didn't run her parents down. But in the precise way of someone choosing every word, she let me know there'd been a great deal of talk in that house about money, and about what Grandpa had left, and that she hadn't been comfortable with the sound of it. I didn't ask her to take a side. I only asked her to stay in my life. She said she wasn't going anywhere. Pearl came for tea twice that week. Lois and I walked the river trail on a Thursday morning. Reverend Mackenzie dropped by Friday with 2 butter tarts from the church bake sale wrapped in a napkin. Not one of them knew the details. But their being there reminded me of the thing my daughter's husband had badly miscalculated. He'd looked at a woman in her 70s, still half blind with grief, and seen someone easy to back into a corner. He hadn't reckoned on the fact that I'd built a whole life full of real people, and that not one of them was for sale. For a few weeks, the legal side went quiet, and the quiet felt less like peace than like a held breath. I used the time. I went through everything Kathleen had organized. I updated my own will with Joan, to reflect the whole estate and to set aside a sum for Maddie, to come to her when she turned 30, independent of her parents entirely. I put the duplex under proper management. I consolidated the accounts piece by piece. I was building a wall, and not out of anger, but out of my husband's instructions, carried out the careful way he'd have carried them out himself. They came on a Saturday in late June, 3 weeks after the flowers. I saw his car in the drive from the upstairs window and felt my stomach pull tight before I reminded myself, "You are ready for this." I put the kettle on and opened the door with a calm face. My daughter was carrying a bakery box, the cinnamon rolls from the good place on the main street, the ones I'd always loved. My son-in-law looked tired, and for one treacherous moment, the mother in me wanted to reach for that tiredness and soothe it. I served the tea. I put the rolls on a plate. We sat at the kitchen table where I'd read Gordon's letter and made my decisions and cried. And I sat at the head of it because it was my table. She opened gently. She talked about how hard the spring had been. She talked about how hard the spring had been. She talked about how grief makes people do things they regret. She talked about family, about how at the end of it all, family is everything. She told a story about her father teaching her to back a trailer down the cottage road that I'm fairly sure she'd improved a good deal in the telling. She was skilled. I'll give her that, and it broke my heart to think who had taught her to be. Then, by degrees so smooth you'd have missed them if you weren't braced for it, the talk turned. There was a family mediator, she said. Not a lawyer, just someone who helped families through hard transitions. Might that be healthier than going through lawyers? She said the word lawyers the way you'd say a disease. Her father surely wouldn't have wanted conflict, she said. Surely there was a way to honor his memory together. And I noticed that in 3/4 of an hour, not once had either of them asked how I was doing. Her husband leaned in then. He said he wasn't trying to take anything from me. He said he only wanted to feel that Gordon had thought of him, had cared about his future. His voice caught a little on the word future. And I watched it and I held my own face very still, the way you carry a full cup across a room, because here is the truth. I believed on some level that the catch in his voice was real. My daughter had truly lost her father. Even her husband may have had fears that weren't entirely cold. But real pain doesn't entitle anyone to what belongs to someone else. And the shape of that conversation, the cinnamon rolls and the mediator and the carefully measured tears, was not the shape of two people trying to mend something. It was the shape of a negotiation, one where I'd been seated so that saying no would feel like cruelty. I'd spent 31 years reading people in hospital beds and the faces of their families in waiting rooms. I knew exactly what it looks like when someone is being steered toward an answer that was decided before they walked in. I let them finish. I didn't rush a word of it. Then I folded my hands on the table. "I love you," I said to my daughter. "That isn't in question, and it never will be. But I'm not going to discuss the estate outside of proper legal channels, not because I'm against you, because your father asked me to handle this carefully, and I mean to." I watched something cross her husband's face, a flicker, quickly tidied away, the way a light changes color on a stage. And then my daughter's voice changed too, the warmth gone, the old tightness back. "Do you understand," she said, "that if you won't work with us, we'll file the challenge? Do you know how that's going to look? A woman your age making decisions like this alone, shutting out her own family." There it was, the mask off at last. "I understand," I said. "Joan Albright has already prepared a response. I'd speak to your own lawyer before you decide." "We have documentation," her husband said, his voice precise now. "Emails. People wholesale Gordon wasn't always clear in his last year. I'll tell you what I expected to feel in that moment, and what I felt instead. I expected fear or fury. What came was a sudden cold stillness, not from being numb, but from being certain. I knew they were bluffing. I knew it because Gordon's doctors had documented him to the last, because Mr. Gentitabout Fenwick had sat across from a sharp and steady man twice a year for 12 years, and would say so, because that ledger was the work of a mind in perfect order right up to the January before he died. Whatever they had, it wasn't enough, and I suspected they knew it, which is why they'd come with cinnamon rolls first. "Then file," I said. They left without finishing their tea. The challenge was filed in July, a petition to the court claiming my husband had been in cognitive decline and that the hidden assets had been built up while he wasn't himself, asking that everything be split down the middle. Joan filed our response, and it was a thing of beauty in its plainness. Gordon's medical records from his last 3 years, including the cognitive checks his doctors had done as a matter of course, all clean. A signed letter from Mr. Fenwick attesting to a clear-minded man across 12 years of visits. And the ledger itself, with entries made 8 weeks before his death, dated and cross-referenced and totaled, the work of a man paying close attention. A person in decline does not keep a book like that. And then there was the same Joan had come by quietly that I didn't know about until the day before the hearing. My son-in-law's mediator, it turned out, was no neutral party, but someone he'd used in a business dispute years before. In setting it all up, he put his strategy in writing in a string of emails, and through a chain Joan would only describe as legally obtained, and that being enough for me, those emails had come into her hands. In them, in his own words, before any of the flowers and tears, he called the assets leverage. He described the mediator plan as a way to get her to the table before she lawyers up. And in one sentence, I will carry to my own grave, he referred to me, his wife's mother, as the soft target. I read it 3 times. I thought about the cinnamon rolls. I thought about the improved story of the trailer down the cottage road. All of it written out in advance in his own hand. And then I set the pages down, and I didn't cry. Because I had nothing left to spend on that man's opinion of me. What I felt was the small final click of a lock turning, the sound of a thing being exactly what it had always been. The hearing was a small, procedural affair, the way these are. No jury, no gallery, just the judge and the lawyers and a clerk and us. My daughter and her husband were already seated, their lawyer between them like a seam. She wouldn't look at me. My son-in-law did, once, then away. Joan walked the judge through the medical records, through Mr. Fenwick's letter, through the ledger. Unhurried, the way the truth is unhurried when it's been properly laid out. And then she introduced the emails and the room came apart. Their lawyer asked for a recess. During it, I watched a crack run right through their composed front, my daughter speaking fast and low, her husband sitting very still in the way people sit when something inside them has gone quiet. When it resumed, my daughter took the stand, and Joan asked her, gently, to date the conversations that had shown her father's confusion. She couldn't. Joan asked whether she'd ever raised these concerns with any of his doctors while he was alive, or with me. The answer each time, after a long pause, was no. So these worries about your father's mind, Joan said, and it wasn't a question, arose after he died. Yes, my daughter whispered. Thank you, Joan said. Nothing further. The judge ruled that afternoon. The petition was dismissed entirely. The estate stood exactly as my husband had left it, wholly mine, exactly as he'd intended. The judge noted that the evidence of Gordon's clear mind was thorough and consistent, and that the petition had been poorly supported and undermined by the timing and the circumstances of its filing. That last phrase, the circumstances of its filing, was a small, precise cut, and I think my son-in-law understood it better than anyone else in that room. What happened after, I did not arrange, and I want to be clear about that. The emails were never proof of any crime, because strategizing about an inheritance, however ugly, is not against the law. But they sat in the public record now, where anyone could find a man who'd written soft target about a grieving widow. My son-in-law sold investments and arranged mortgages for the people of a small county, and reputation in a place like this moves through the air like weather, not always fair, but very consistent. By the fall, he'd lost most of his clients, and by Christmas, the firm he worked for had let him go. I heard it from Lois, who'd heard it from someone else. I took no pleasure in it. I'd never wanted the man ruined. I'd only ever wanted what my husband left me. That those two things turned out to be tied together was his doing, not mine. My daughter called me once, 2 weeks after the hearing. And it was the hardest call of the whole business, harder than the one where she'd threatened me. She wasn't angry. She was defeated, and her voice had lost the inflections her husband used to put in it. And she sounded, for the first time in years, like herself, like my girl from before. She said she was sorry. She said she'd let someone else do her thinking. She said she'd been remembering her father, the actual man, apart from what she'd been told his money meant. I listened to all of it without filling the silences, because mothers learn to hold a silence. "Are we okay?" she asked at the end, and the question was so small and so bare that I heard the child in it. "We're not okay right now," I told her, "but I'm not finished with you. Do you understand what I mean?" "Yes," she said. "Then give it time," I said, "and go and talk to someone, a real someone, not a mediator. Someone who'll tell you the truth when it's hard to hear." She said she would. She and her husband separated by the autumn. Maddie came east for Christmas, drove in from the airport through the snow with a bottle of good wine, and that rare full attention the young so seldom give the old. We made the turkey together. She told me, carefully and without a hint of triumph, about her parents. I listened the same way. I felt no victory in it, only the particular sadness of watching two people learn that choices have weight. I kept everything Gordon left me, and I changed nothing for the sake of changing it. The RIF rolled to me clean. The duplex pays its rent every month, and that quiet money has lifted a low hum of worry I'd carried my whole adult life and never named. I gave a portion to the church for the new furnace. I set Maddie's share aside in an account with her name on it. I had the front porch painted the sage green Gordon once pointed at approvingly in a flyer and never got around to. Pearl says it's the prettiest house on the street now. I joined a watercolor class at the seniors center that my sister had been after me about for 10 years. I am not any good at it. I go every Tuesday all the same. In the spring, Bev and I are driving out to the Maritimes to see the tide come in at the Bay of Fundy, because I've lived 71 years in this country and never seen it, and because I can. On Christmas Eve, after Maddie had gone up to bed, I took Gordon's ledger out of the drawer in his old desk by the window that looks onto the garden. I'm slowly bringing back. I traced the first line with my finger. The entry dated in March of 2003, and I thought about a man who carried something invisible for more than a decade, trusting that when the time came I'd know what to do with it. Joan sent me a card after it was all done, on her firm's stationery, and all it said was, "Your husband chose well." I had it framed. I keep it where I can see it on the hard days. Here is the one thing I'd ask you to take from an old woman in a small town, if you take anything at all. Trust is not the same as being a fool. My husband trusted me with his eyes wide open after 47 years of knowing exactly who I was. And grief is not weakness. Anyone who looks at a widow and sees a soft target has made a terrible mistake about what loss does to a person. Gordon was brave enough in the end to protect me, and it turned out I was brave enough to be worth it. The thing I keep coming back to on the quiet nights is that the money in that box was never really what Gordon left me. The money was just the proof. What he actually left me was the shape of how a person ought to act when no one is watching, and that turned out to be worth far more than any ledger. I've had a long time now to see how it all fit together, link by link. Gordon spent 12 years being honest in the smallest, most private way a man can be honest, keeping a careful book, telling the manager the truth, doing the right thing slowly and without applause. None of that was for show, and because he'd lived plain and straight his whole life, there was nothing for anyone to twist. When Trevor went looking for a crack to claim my husband wasn't himself, there wasn't one, because Gordon had never given himself permission to be anything other than exactly who he was. A clean life is its own kind of armor. I understand that now. I also learned that being soft-hearted and being soft-headed are not the same thing, though plenty of people will bet your life savings that they are. Trevor looked at a grieving widow and saw an easy mark. What he didn't count on was that 31 years of reading frightened families across a hospital bed teaches you to tell real concern from a performance. I let myself feel the fear, but I didn't let it do my thinking for me. I got my own lawyer. I read the room. I waited. Seeing a thing clearly, even when it breaks your heart to see it, is not coldness. It's the only way to protect what matters. And I won't pretend the steadiness came easy. There were mornings I sat at that kitchen table and shook. Being threatened by your own daughter is a particular kind of cold. But I'd watch myself hold the line one more day and then another, the way you split one more piece of wood when your arms are already done. Trevor lost everything he lost because of words he chose to write down. Diane is slowly finding her way back because she finally had to face what her choices weighed. Nobody handed either of them that. They earned it. Same as I earned my quiet by not folding. So if you take anything from an old woman, take this. Live so plainly that no one can ever invent a lie about you. Keep your eyes open even when love makes you want to close them. And when the fear comes, and it will, plant your feet and stay one more day. Those 3 things saved me, and they cost me nothing but the courage to use them. Gordon was brave enough at the end to trust me with all of it. The least I could do was prove him right.